In this video, I'm going to give a brief history of Alexander II. I'm going to try and do this for all of the Tsars and all of the Russian leaders from 1855 to 1964. We'll see how far I get. But this video focuses on Alexander II. Now, it's important that we start with Alexander II in terms of what he inherited. And what he inherited was an absolutely ginormous country and actually really an empire. Russia. And Russia in 1855 was not something that you would have wanted to inherit, because it was riddled with problems that Alexander took on himself. Firstly, 90% of the population was peasants, and most of those people were serfs. Serfs is a simple way of basically describing slaves in Russia at this point. So the rest of Europe had got rid of slavery, Russia had not. Those serfs caused many problems, both for the economy, for the military, and really importantly, politically, because the serfs were unhappy and they threatened to rise up and really get rid of the institution of Tsardom. Only 1% of the population was nobility, and they had all the power. So this is a completely unweighted society. That's an issue, because again, you've got this idea of potentially revolution happening. Revolution was happening in other places in Europe and getting rid of their nobility and getting rid of their monarchs. Alexander was aware of that. Russia was at an interesting point. And lastly, and probably most importantly, Russia had also, in the short term, just failed the Crimean War. Fighting against the French and the British in the Crimea between 1853 and 1856 completely humiliated Russia. Russia, this giant empire, virtually fighting really on home soil, lost. And they lost miserably. So Alexander takes over a country that is unhappy, that's just lost a war and is economically screwed. He realises he needs to make big changes. The first of those big changes happens in 1861. And in 1861, he immediately, 6 years into his reign, deals with the issue of serfs. And he issues the Emancipation Declaration. And what that does is, this is him on the steps here doing it, he immediately says that the institution of serfdom is going to be get rid of in Russia. Now that, on the surface, sounds like a great thing. And on the surface it was, because 23 million serfs were freed. That has got to be a great thing. However, there were loads of caveats in this declaration of emancipation. And the caveats meant that actually slavery was really kept there, but in a different form. Firstly, freed serfs had to pay redemption payments for 49 years at 7%. So the serfs had to buy the land that they were working on at a huge amount of interest for a huge amount of years. And importantly, 49 years, massively over the average age of death for these people. Secondly, most of those serfs were still tied to the land and the area that they were working in. And they were now tied to an organisation called the Mir, or the local council. And the Mir really stopped them moving, controlled who got what land, and it was pretty a miserable existence. So although they are technically freed, they're not really. Really serfdom stays, but in a different form. That meant that the economic problems that Alexander was facing and Russia was facing still continue. But he does launch into this period of reform, and one of the things that Alex is most known for is being a reformer. And lots of things do get reformed in this period. So for example, in 1864, local government reforms start getting pushed through for the first time. So proper local government starts cropping up across Russia at this time, and they're called zemstva. And zemstva were great because they give people a chance to be involved in politics for the first time. A brilliant thing. Judicial reform also happens in 1864. Judges were better trained. They introduced juries for the first time. So Russia's judicial system, which had been pretty backward until this point, now resembles a lot more like the rest of Europe was. He introduces military reform following the crisis in the Crimea. So conscription becomes better. They introduce better training and better equipment. He also introduces new education reforms, so primary and secondary education is opened to everybody and all classes for the first time. And censorship is also reformed. There is now more freedom for publishers. All those things on the screen here are a good thing. Russia is becoming a more liberal, more educated, more involved society. But there's a problem with that. And the more that you educate people and the more that they become liberated, the more they realise the problems that they are living in their society. So Alexander II does make things better. But unfortunately for him, he's now got a group of people who are building up, who now know they are living in a serious problem. But Alex doesn't reform for his entire reign, because in 1866 he faces an assassination attempt. An assassination attempt by this man here. And in nearly being assassinated, Alexander realises that actually maybe he shouldn't have been doing what he was doing. He gets a second opinion, he gets a new thought about whether reform is a good thing. And after this assassination attempt, arguably, Alex launches into a period of counter-reform. So where before he was trying to make Russia more liberal, he now goes back on some of those reforms. So really importantly, liberal ministers are completely replaced. Shuvalov is made the head of the third section, which is the secret police at the time. Tolstoy, who was incredibly reactionary and conservative, was made education minister. This was not good for Russia. Censorship is tightened and military courts are used again. So again, he's going back on some of those reforms. And education in particular is restricted. And in universities, liberal subjects, those great ones like history, where you have to think, are now banned. So there is a period of reform, and then there is a period of counter-reform in Alexander II's reign. Growing underneath this is the story of how opposition grows. And unsurprisingly, both the reform and the counter-reform mean opposition grows. And opposition to the Tsar grows throughout this reign, but it's important that you remember that they are still a very small minority, and they are very well controlled by things like the third section. But there are great thinkers in this period of time, and those great thinkers suggest new ways for Russia to live and exist. And those great thinkers inspire people to really start opposing the Tsar for the first time. And opposition is inspired by great Russian thinkers like Chernyshevsky and Herzen, who write prominent books at this time and inspire others to oppose. Lots of different groups of opposition form, but probably the most significant really is the Narodniks. And the Narodniks have this great idea that what they're going to do is go out into the countryside and go to the people and persuade the peasants to revolt against the Tsar. And they go in 1874 and they go in 1876. And this is middle class, educated people who dress up like peasants and basically go out there and patronise the peasantry. They fail miserably. The peasants aren't that stupid. They realise these people are patronising them. They love the Tsar, and they tell them to leave and go away. So the Narodniks fail. And in failing, they form a new group, Land and Liberty, and they split into two rival factions. The Black Partition, which sounds incredibly badass, but actually wasn't, and the People's Will, which doesn't sound badass, but actually was. Now already from this screen here, what you will notice is that opposition is split, disorganised, not agreeing with each other. That meant it was an advantage for Alex. But unfortunately for Alex, the People's Will, who I have just said are badass, in 1881 take their revenge. And in 1881, they successfully lead an assassination of Alexander II. So he dies in 1881. Now, Alex's reign goes from 1855 to 1881. And I think it's important to consider his legacy. And the really important bit of analysis that we need to do and think about is he the Tsar liberator? This statue is in Sofia and is known as the Tsar Liberator, a statue to Alexander II, who liberated Russia. And I think it's important that we start considering whether he did that. On the one hand, he does. He puts in some important reforms that does change modern Russia and means Russia is stepping towards modernity way more than it was before. Arguably, though, he was not the Tsar Liberator. After that period of reform, he put through a series of counter-reforms that are harsh and repressive. The people of Russia are still living with the same problems that they were in 1881 than they were in 1885. Not much has changed. We'll see whether things do under Alexander II's son, Alexander III.